American 317, we need your silent passenger in the cockpit, she's our only chance. Nobody knew Seat 14A held Lieutenant Phantom Novak until F-16 fighters recognized her call sign mid-disaster. Catastrophic hydraulic failure. 267 souls plummeting. She hasn't flown since trauma stole her voice. One laptop. Impossible odds. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was American Airlines Flight 317, a Thursday afternoon departure from Chicago O'Hare International Airport bound for Phoenix Sky Harbor, scheduled to land at 4:15 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on March 14, 2024. The Boeing 777-300ER carried 267 passengers and crew members, cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet somewhere over the Colorado Rockies at exactly 2:47 p.m. when everything normal about that flight was about to shatter. The afternoon sun blazed through the oval window of Seat 14A as Alessa Novak pressed her forehead against the cool plastic, watching the endless expanse of white clouds drift beneath the silver wing. Her noise-canceling headphones created a cocoon of silence around her, blocking out the constant hum of twin engines and the murmur of conversations filling the cabin. She looked young, 26 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a gray hoodie and black jeans that made her blend seamlessly into the background of ordinary travelers making their way across America on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. A large burgundy scarf wrapped around her neck despite the cabin's comfortable temperature of 72 degrees. Her face held that distant, vacant expression of someone lost deep inside their own thoughts, someone who had learned to live inside their head because the outside world had become too painful to fully engage with. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers occasionally twitching as if typing on an invisible keyboard, a nervous habit she had developed over the past 17 months of her new, silent life. The flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the practiced smile of someone who had walked these narrow aisles 10,000 times, stopped her cart beside row 14. "Can I get you something to drink, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular brightness that flight attendants use to cut through the monotony of service at altitude. Alessa looked up, and without hesitation, pointed to her throat with one hand while shaking her head slowly with an apologetic expression. It was a gesture she had performed hundreds of times over the past year and a half, a universal symbol that required no words, no explanation, no uncomfortable questions. The message was clear and simple: I cannot speak. The flight attendant's expression immediately shifted to one of gentle sympathy. "Oh, I'm so sorry, honey. Let me grab you one of our communication cards." She reached into a compartment beneath her cart and produced a laminated card with pictures of beverages, snacks, and common requests. The header read, "For passengers with speech disabilities, please point to what you need, and we'll be happy to assist you." Alessa took the card with a small, grateful smile and pointed to the image of a water bottle. The flight attendant handed her one immediately, touching Alessa's shoulder with maternal warmth. "You just wave if you need anything else, okay? Anything at all." Alessa nodded, and the flight attendant moved on, already focused on the businessman in seat 14B who was barking his order for scotch on the rocks without looking up from his laptop spreadsheet filled with numbers that apparently mattered more than common courtesy. The businessman, mid-40s, expensive suit, wedding ring that looked too tight on his finger, glanced sideways at Alessa after the cart passed. His eyes held that particular mixture of pity and discomfort that people show when confronted with disability, that awkward awareness that they're grateful it's not them, combined with guilt about feeling grateful. He returned to his spreadsheet quickly, as if her silence might be contagious. In seat 14C, an elderly woman with silver hair and a floral print dress leaned toward her husband in 14D and whispered in a voice she thought was quiet but that Alessa could hear perfectly, "Poor thing, so young to have such problems. Can you imagine not being able to speak? At her age? My heart just breaks for her." Her husband made a noncommittal sound and went back to his Tom Clancy novel, clearly having learned over decades of marriage when to engage and when to simply nod. Nobody on Flight 317 knew the truth about Alessa Novak. Nobody knew that she wasn't born mute. Nobody knew that her silence wasn't the result of some childhood illness or tragic accident. Nobody knew that just 17 months ago, she had possessed a voice that could cut through radio static, deliver mission briefings with crystalline clarity, and laugh so hard at her brother's stupid jokes that her fellow officers would tell her to keep it down in the mess hall. Nobody knew that she was Lieutenant Alessa Phantom Novak, formerly one of the United States Air Force's most gifted and decorated drone combat pilots, a woman who had flown Predator and Reaper unmanned aerial vehicles from a climate-controlled bunker in Creech Air Force Base, Nevada, conducting surveillance and precision strikes halfway across the world with surgical accuracy that had made her a legend among her peers. Her call sign, Phantom, had been earned through 4 years of flawless operations. She moved through the sky like a ghost, silent, invisible, inevitable. Targets never knew death was watching from 20,000 feet above their heads until the Hellfire missile was already in flight, and by then it was far too late for prayers or running or anything except the brief, terrible knowledge that they had been seen by someone who never missed. She had been brilliant at her job. Methodical. Professional. She had flown 237 combat missions without a single error, without ever hitting the wrong target, without ever letting emotion cloud her judgment. She had been the pilot they sent when the margin for error was zero, when civilian casualties were unacceptable, when the target absolutely, positively had to be eliminated with no collateral damage. Until the mission that broke her. It had been a Tuesday night in Nevada, which meant it was Wednesday morning in the mountainous region of eastern Afghanistan where her Reaper drone circled at 18,000 feet. The target was a high-value Taliban commander who had orchestrated 3 attacks on coalition forces in the past month, a man responsible for the deaths of 14 American soldiers and countless Afghan civilians. Intelligence had confirmed his location in a compound outside a small village, a standalone structure used as a command center, cleared of all civilians, occupied only by enemy combatants. Alessa had reviewed the intelligence packets 3 times. Thermal imaging showed 7 heat signatures inside the building, all adult-sized, all male according to the pattern of life analysis. Communications intercepts confirmed the target was inside. Rules of engagement were clear, weapons free, proceed with strike. She had lined up the shot with her usual precision, her right hand steady on the controller that functioned exactly like a video game joystick except that the stakes were measured in human lives instead of points. Her left hand had managed the camera systems, keeping the crosshairs perfectly centered on the compound's main structure. The Hellfire AGM-114 missile had hung beneath her drone's wing, waiting for her command. "Phantom, you are cleared hot," her ground commander had said through her headset. "Take the shot." Her thumb had pressed the trigger. The missile had dropped, motor igniting, streaking toward Earth at supersonic speed, trailing white smoke through the dawn light. The flight time was 14 seconds. Alessa had counted each one, watching through her high-resolution camera as the missile grew closer, closer, until it punched through the compound's roof and detonated with the characteristic orange flash that she had seen dozens of times before. The building had collapsed. Secondary explosions indicated weapons storage. Everything had gone exactly according to plan, exactly as it should have, a textbook strike that would be used in training presentations. And then, in the seconds after the explosion, as smoke and dust cleared and Alessa zoomed her camera in to conduct bomb damage assessment, she had seen it. Small. Pink. Tumbling through the settling dust. A child's shoe. Tiny, with cartoon characters on the side, the kind a little girl might wear, maybe size 6, maybe for a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, someone who still believed in cartoons and bedtime stories and mothers who tucked them in at night. Alessa's breath had stopped. Her hands had frozen on the controls. She had zoomed the camera closer, desperately hoping she was wrong, desperately needing it to be anything else, a piece of fabric, a toy, trash, anything but what it so obviously was. But the camera was high resolution. 4K clarity. She could see the little buckle on the side of the shoe. Could see the scuff marks on the toe from a child running and playing. Could see the pink so bright and innocent against the gray rubble. "Phantom, confirmed target destroyed," her ground commander had said. "Good strike. Come back to holding pattern. She hadn't responded. Couldn't respond. Because she was staring at that shoe and understanding with horrible, crystalline certainty that the intelligence had been wrong. The thermal signatures hadn't shown everyone. The communications intercepts hadn't told the whole story. There had been civilians in that building. There had been children. She had killed them. From 7,000 miles away, sitting in an air-conditioned bunker with a cup of coffee at her elbow, she had pressed a button and erased children from existence. Phantom, do you copy? Her commander's voice had been sharp. Confirmed target destroyed. That's when Alessa had started screaming. Not words. Just sound. Raw, animal sound that tore from her throat like her body was trying to expel something poisonous, something that would kill her if it stayed inside. She had screamed until her vision blurred, until other officers had grabbed her shoulders, until the medical officer had arrived running because everyone in the operations center could hear that this wasn't just stress or fear but something breaking, something fundamental snapping like a cable under too much tension. She had screamed until blood had filled her throat. The doctors later explained that she had hemorrhaged her vocal cords, damaged them so severely from the force and duration that blood had pooled in her larynx. She had screamed until the medic had jabbed a sedative into her arm, until darkness had pulled her down into unconsciousness that was a mercy compared to the waking nightmare of that pink shoe tumbling through smoke. When she had woken up 3 days later in the base hospital at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, with her brother holding her hand and crying, she had tried to speak and nothing had come out. No sound. No words. Just breath and silence. The doctors had run every test. Her vocal cords were healing, the physical damage wasn't permanent. Her larynx was intact. There was no physiological reason she couldn't speak. But she couldn't. The diagnosis was psychogenic aphonia, trauma-induced mutism. Her mind had locked away her voice as a protective mechanism, a way of preventing her from ever giving another order, ever making another call, ever speaking words that might lead to death. Her subconscious had decided that if she had no voice, she could never hurt anyone again. The investigation had followed. The intelligence failure had been confirmed. A family of refugees had been sheltering in the compound without the knowledge of the Taliban fighters, who had used them as human shields. 4 children had died, along with their mother and grandmother. The Taliban commander had survived, escaping through a tunnel before the strike. Alessa had killed 6 innocent people, including 4 children, while the actual target had walked away. The Air Force had cleared her of any wrongdoing. The failure was in the intelligence chain, not in her execution of the mission. She had followed proper procedures, confirmed all targeting criteria, acted within the rules of engagement. She was a victim of bad information, they said, not a perpetrator of a war crime. But Alessa knew better. She had pulled the trigger. She had sent that missile. Her hand, her decision, her action had turned those children into pink shoes tumbling through rubble. The Air Force had given her a medical discharge with honors. They had provided counseling, medication for depression and anxiety, a disability rating that came with monthly checks. They had given her everything except a way to undo what she had done, everything except those children's lives back, everything except her voice. For 17 months, she had lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment in Tempe, Arizona, 20 minutes from her brother's house. She saw a therapist twice a week, a kind woman named Dr. Sarah Chen who specialized in PTSD and never pushed Alessa to speak, who had helped her learn basic American Sign Language, who had been patient through the panic attacks and the nightmares and the days when Alessa couldn't get out of bed because the weight of her guilt was too heavy to lift. She had sold her gaming console 3 months after the discharge because holding the controller had made her hands shake so badly she dropped it and then vomited into her kitchen sink. The controller felt too much like the one she'd used in the bunker, the one connected to death delivered from the sky, and she couldn't separate the muscle memory of playing video games from the muscle memory of firing missiles. She hadn't touched any flight control system since that day. Couldn't even look at pictures of drones without her heart rate spiking to 140 beats per minute, without her vision narrowing, without her hands going numb. She had thrown out every piece of Air Force memorabilia, every photo from her service, every reminder of Lieutenant Novak who used to fly with the call sign Phantom. She had tried to build a new life in silence. She took online classes in graphic design because it required no talking. She volunteered at an animal shelter because dogs didn't care if she could speak. She learned to communicate through text messages, through notes on her phone, through the basic signs she practiced with Dr. Chen. But mostly she had stayed inside her apartment, existing rather than living, waiting for the weight to get lighter even though she suspected it never would. This flight to Phoenix was her first time traveling since the discharge. Her brother Marcus, 2 years younger, a high school math teacher, the only person who still looked at her like she was a whole person instead of a damaged thing, had begged her to visit. His wife had just had a baby, Alessa's first niece, and he wanted his sister to meet her. He wanted Alessa to hold the baby and remember that life created things as well as destroyed them. Alessa had almost cancelled 3 times. The thought of airport crowds, of being surrounded by strangers, of navigating an unfamiliar situation without being able to speak, had sent her into spirals of anxiety that required extra medication to manage. But Dr. Chen had encouraged her. "You can't hide forever, Alessa," she had said in their last session, her voice gentle but firm. "Trauma wants you to stay small, to stay safe, to never risk being hurt again. But that's not living. That's just surviving. And you deserve more than survival." So Alessa had booked the ticket. She had packed her bag. She had taken an Uber to O'Hare that morning at dawn, had navigated security with her medical documentation explaining her mutism, had boarded flight 317 and found seat 14A next to the window where she could watch the world pass beneath her without having to engage with it. The flight was supposed to be simple. 2 hours and 43 minutes in the air. She would sleep, or listen to music, or watch the clouds, and then Marcus would pick her up in Phoenix and she would hold her niece and try to pretend she could be normal again, try to pretend that silence was just an inconvenience and not a prison sentence. But somewhere over the mountains of Colorado, at exactly 2:47 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on March 14, 2024, Alessa's carefully avoided past was about to crash into her present in the most impossible, terrifying, redemptive way. The emergency began without warning, the way catastrophic failures always do. Captain Robert Hayes was a 34-year veteran of commercial aviation with 7 million miles under his belt and a safety record that was absolutely spotless. At 58 years old, with silver hair and the kind of steady hands that came from decades of experience, he had flown through everything: storms, engine failures, medical emergencies, difficult passengers, and that one time in 2019 when he'd had to divert to Denver because a woman in first class had gone into labor and delivered twins at 33,000 feet. He was coordinating a routine altitude adjustment with Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center when every single alarm in the cockpit suddenly screamed at once. Master caution lights blazed red across the instrument panel. Warning tones blared through the flight deck speakers. His first officer, Jessica Park, 32 years old, former Navy pilot, sharp as a blade and unflappable under pressure, stared at her display screen in the kind of horror that comes from seeing something that should be impossible. "Captain, we're losing hydraulics." Jessica's voice was tight but controlled, running on training that had been drilled into her through 10,000 hours of flight time. All 3 systems showing pressure drop simultaneously. Robert's hands instinctively tightened on the control yoke, and immediately he felt something terribly wrong. The aircraft's response was sluggish, mushy, dying like a living thing bleeding out. The yoke that should have felt responsive and precise now moved with the resistance of pushing through mud. How? Robert's mind raced through system schematics he'd memorized decades ago. All 3 hydraulic systems failing at the same time. That's not possible. They're completely independent circuits. There's no single point of failure that should affect all 3. It's happening anyway. Jessica's fingers flew across the checklist display, pulling up emergency procedures that she'd practiced in simulators but had never, in 15 years of flying, actually needed to use in real life. Primary hydraulics at 15% and falling. Backup system at 10%. Emergency hydraulic system showing critical pressure loss, "Captain, we're going to lose all flight control authority. We're going to lose the ability to steer this aircraft." In the cabin, passengers felt the first indication that something was wrong. The smooth, steady flight they had been enjoying for the past hour and 17 minutes suddenly became jerky, unstable. The aircraft shuddered like a horse trying to throw its rider. Several people looked up from their phones and tablets, expressions shifting from boredom to concern. Flight attendants grabbed seat backs for balance as the floor beneath them tilted unexpectedly. Sarah Morrison, the lead flight attendant who had given Alessa the communication card earlier, caught herself against row 9 and exchanged a quick, worried glance with her colleague David Chen at the front galley. A child somewhere in the middle of the cabin started crying, that particular pitch of fear that children have when they sense adults are scared. Robert keyed his radio, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had been trained never to let passengers hear panic, no matter how bad things got. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. American Airlines Flight 317, catastrophic hydraulic failure, all 3 systems compromised. Unable to maintain stable flight. Request immediate." The aircraft lurched violently to the left with a force that sent loose items flying. Overhead bins popped open, showering passengers with luggage and coats. Screams filled the cabin. A flight attendant slammed into a bulkhead with a sickening thud. Someone's laptop went skittering down the aisle. "I've got almost nothing." Robert grunted, fighting the controls with both hands, every muscle in his arms straining against the dying hydraulics. "We're going to lose this aircraft." Jessica's hands moved with desperate speed across the control panel, trying to route emergency power, trying to find any backup system that might give them a few more minutes of control authority. Trying to boost emergency hydraulic pressure, nothing. The whole system is bleeding out. In seat 14A, Alessa's eyes snapped open behind her headphones. Those weren't normal turbulence movements. Those weren't the random bumps and sways that happened when an aircraft hit pockets of rough air. Alessa's trained mind, the mind that had spent 4 years and 4,000 hours analyzing flight dynamics, understanding how aircraft moved through 3-dimensional space, recognizing the difference between normal flight and system failures, immediately registered what was happening. That specific jerking motion, that particular combination of roll and yaw instability, the way the aircraft was shuddering and fighting itself, she had seen it before in simulations and in real-world combat damage assessments. This was control surface failure. Multiple control surfaces losing hydraulic pressure simultaneously. Rudder authority compromised. Aileron response degraded. Elevator control failing. Her heart, which had been beating at its normal resting rate of 68 beats per minute, suddenly kicked into overdrive, slamming in her chest at over 100 beats per minute. But it wasn't panic. It was the immediate, instinctive response of a combat pilot recognizing an emergency situation and automatically shifting into operational mode. She pulled off her noise-canceling headphones and the full scope of the disaster flooded her ears. Around her, passengers were panicking. The businessman in 14B had gone pale as paper, his knuckles white where he gripped his armrest hard enough that the plastic was creaking. The elderly woman in 14C was praying rapidly in Spanish, her voice shaking, tears streaming down her face while her husband held her hand and stared straight ahead with the frozen expression of someone facing their mortality. But Alessa wasn't listening to the passengers. She was listening to the aircraft itself, the engine sounds, the airflow noise, the groaning of the airframe under stress, the hydraulic whine that was growing fainter and more erratic. Years of training had taught her to hear what others couldn't, to read an aircraft's health through sound the way a doctor reads a patient's heart through a stethoscope. What she heard told her this wasn't just a failure. This was a cascade. Something catastrophic had happened to the entire hydraulic distribution system, probably a turbine blade failure that had sent shrapnel through the belly of the aircraft, puncturing all 3 hydraulic lines in the vulnerable area where they ran closest together. It was the kind of failure that engineers designed against, the kind of failure that should have been impossible, but that clearly, terrifyingly, was happening anyway. In the cockpit, Denver Center's voice came through the radio, tense but professional. "American 317, we copy your mayday. We're scrambling emergency response. Nearest suitable airport is Colorado Springs Municipal, 47 miles southeast of your current position. Can you make it? Robert watched his control displays becoming less responsive with each passing second. The hydraulic pressure gauges were dropping like fuel gauges with the tank punctured. He had maybe 3 minutes, maybe less, before the controls stopped responding altogether, before this aircraft became nothing more than a 350-ton glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. Negative, Denver Center. We're losing control authority too fast. Rate of decay is too steep. We're not going to make any airport. We need something else. Jessica looked at her captain with barely contained terror in her eyes. In all her years of training, in all the emergency scenarios she'd practiced in simulators that could replicate every possible disaster, she had never trained for this specific nightmare, all hydraulics failing simultaneously while still at altitude, too far from any runway, with no backup systems responding. Captain, if we lose all hydraulics before we find somewhere to land. I know. Robert's jaw clenched. His mind was already running through the terrible math of emergency landings on unsuitable terrain. Start preparing the cabin for emergency landing. Wherever we come down, it's going to be hard. Very hard. Then a different voice cut through the radio frequency, sharp, military, carrying an authority that came from combat operations rather than civilian aviation. American 317, this is Viper Lead, F-16 Fighting Falcon out of Peterson Air Force Base. We're launching to provide visual escort and assistance. Maintain your current heading as best you can. We'll be with you in 4 minutes. Robert felt a tiny surge of hope mixed with dread. If the Air Force was scrambling fighters, it meant someone on the ground understood how serious this was. But it also meant they recognized this aircraft might not make it to any runway, might need to be escorted to whatever rough landing site could be found, might even need to be shot down if it was heading toward a populated area with no control authority. Roger, Viper Lead. American 317 copies. We'll do our best to maintain heading, but we're losing control fast. Real fast. Jessica began the grim task of preparing the cabin. She picked up the internal phone and called Sarah Morrison in the galley. Sarah, we need to prepare for emergency landing. Possibly on unsuitable terrain. Follow full emergency protocols. Get passengers in brace positions. Make sure everyone knows to grab ankles, heads down, and that it's going to be a very hard impact. Sarah's voice came back steady despite the fear underneath. Copy that. How long do we have? Jessica looked at the hydraulic pressure gauges, watching the numbers drop. 5 minutes. Maybe less. Those 4 minutes waiting for the F-16s felt like hours. The aircraft continued to deteriorate, becoming harder and harder to control. Robert and Jessica worked together with the kind of seamless coordination that comes from flying together for 3 years, anticipating each other's moves, splitting tasks without needing to discuss who did what. Let's try asymmetric thrust for directional control, Robert said. Reduce left engine to 70%, bring right engine to 90%. See if we can maintain heading with thrust differential. Jessica made the adjustments. The aircraft's leftward drift slowed slightly. It's helping. A little. But Captain, we can't maintain altitude this way. The drag is bleeding our energy too fast. I know. We're committed to landing now whether we like it or not. We're not making any airport. At exactly 2:51 p.m., 4 minutes after the hydraulic failure began, 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons screamed into formation alongside the crippled airliner. The lead fighter, piloted by Major Alex "Viper" Rodriguez, a combat veteran with 2 deployments to the Middle East and 600 hours in the F-16, positioned himself off the 777's right wing close enough to see into the cockpit windows. American 317, Viper has visual contact. We're going to do a quick assessment of your aircraft exterior. Stand by. Viper dropped back and below the airliner, his wingman maintaining position above and to the left. What Viper saw through his canopy made his blood run cold. American 317, I can see hydraulic fluid streaming from your belly. You've got a massive breach, looks like multiple punctures in the hydraulic distribution bay. The fluid trail is visible for miles behind you. You're not making any airport. You're not going to make another 5 minutes at this rate. You need to set down now, anywhere you can find. Robert scanned the terrain below through his cockpit windows. The Rocky Mountains stretched in every direction, jagged peaks, dense forests, steep valleys. Nothing remotely suitable for a Boeing 777. Nothing even close. Viper, there's nowhere to land down there. It's all mountains and trees. Then you need a miracle, Viper said bluntly, his voice carrying the hard truth that sometimes survival requires accepting impossible odds. Or you need someone who can fly an aircraft with almost zero hydraulic pressure. American 317, do you have any military pilots aboard? Anyone with experience in manual reversion flying or degraded flight control systems? Robert made a split-second decision. He activated the cabin public address system, his voice broadcasting through every speaker in the aircraft over the terrified murmur of passengers who were now in full crisis mode. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes. We are experiencing a serious emergency and I need your immediate attention. If there are any military pilots aboard this aircraft, especially anyone with experience in emergency flight control systems or flying damaged aircraft, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately. I repeat, any military pilots, please make yourself known to the flight attendants now. The announcement that changed everything hung in the air like smoke. Sarah Morrison and the other flight attendants moved through the cabin with desperate urgency, asking, hoping, praying. Anyone? Any pilots? Military background? Anyone? Most passengers just stared back in terrified confusion. A few men stood up, a former Marine who had never flown anything, a retired Army colonel who had only been a passenger in military transport planes, a private pilot with 300 hours in small Cessnas who knew he was nowhere near qualified for this situation. Except one passenger. In seat 14A, Alessa sat completely frozen, her hands clenched in her lap, her breath coming short and fast. She felt like the cabin was closing in around her, like the walls were pressing toward her chest, like she was back in that bunker in Nevada staring at a pink shoe tumbling through rubble. She wasn't a pilot. She had never flown a manned aircraft. She was a drone operator, remote, distant, controlling aircraft from thousands of miles away through cameras and data feeds. That was completely different from this, from being inside the aircraft, from feeling it die around her, from having 267 people's lives depending on her. And she couldn't even speak. She couldn't communicate complex technical information. She only knew basic American Sign Language that nobody on this aircraft would understand. How could she possibly help when she couldn't tell them what to do? But her training was screaming at her. Her 4 years and 4,000 hours of flight time, her expertise in aerodynamics and flight control systems, her experience landing drones with battle damage using nothing but cameras and instinct and mathematics, all of it was yelling that she understood what was happening to this aircraft. She understood degraded flight controls. She understood how to fly with minimal systems. She had done it dozens of times in combat situations. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and opened the Notes app. Her thumbs moved across the screen, typing desperately. I am military. I can help. But I cannot speak. She waved her phone at Sarah Morrison who was rushing past her row, moving toward the back of the cabin. Ma'am. Ma'am. Sarah stopped, saw the phone screen, and her eyes went wide. She grabbed Alessa's arm. You're military. What branch? What's your specialty? Alessa typed rapidly, her fingers flying, Air Force. Drone pilot. For years combat operations. I flew Reapers and Predators. I can fly degraded systems. Stay right here. Sarah said and ran toward the cockpit, pushing through the crowded aisle, past passengers who grabbed at her asking questions she couldn't stop to answer. 90 seconds later, 90 seconds that felt like an eternity to Alessa as she sat rigid in her seat listening to the aircraft groan and shudder around her. The cockpit door opened and Sarah gestured frantically for her to come forward. Alessa unbuckled her seatbelt with numb fingers. The businessman in 14B stared at her as she stood up, his expression confused. "Wait, you're going to help. But you're..." He didn't finish the sentence but Alessa knew what he was thinking, "But you're disabled. But you can't even talk. How can you possibly help?" She pushed past him and walked toward the cockpit on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, like she was watching herself from outside her body, like this was happening to a different Alessa in a different timeline. The cockpit was chaos. Alarms were still blaring. Robert was fighting the controls with both hands, sweat running down his face despite the air conditioning. Jessica was working through emergency checklists with mechanical efficiency that was barely holding back panic. They both turned to look at Alessa as she entered, this young woman in a hoodie and scarf, mute, looking like she should be a college student going home for spring break, not someone who could possibly help save this dying aircraft. "Are you a pilot?" Robert asked desperately, his voice tight with the strain of maintaining control. Alessa shook her head and held up her phone. Robert read the screen. "Drone operator. Air Force. 4 years experience. I flew Reapers and Predators in combat. I can fly degraded systems." Jessica looked skeptical, her expression shifting between hope and doubt. "Drones aren't the same as a commercial airliner. They're not even close. This is a 350-ton aircraft with 267 people aboard, not a remote-controlled." Alessa was already typing, her fingers moving faster than she'd ever typed before, adrenaline sharpening her focus. Same principles. Same aerodynamics. Same physics. I've landed drones with battle damage using minimal hydraulics. I've flown with 70% system failures. I know how to fly with degraded controls. Let me try. Robert had maybe 2 minutes before complete control loss. Every second he delayed was a second closer to this aircraft becoming unflyable. He looked at this mute young woman with her phone and her desperate eyes, and he made the impossible choice that would either save them all or doom them all. "Tell me what you need." Alessa's fingers flew across her phone screen. Laptop. Aircraft schematics. Access to flight management system. And trust me. Get her laptop from her seat, Robert barked at Sarah who was still standing in the doorway. Now. Sarah ran back into the cabin. The passengers watched in confusion and fear as she grabbed Alessa's backpack from the overhead bin and ran back to the cockpit. What happened next would defy every regulation in aviation, every protocol in the Federal Aviation Administration handbook, every standard procedure that pilots trained for years to follow. But regulations and procedures were written for normal circumstances, and nothing about this situation was normal. Alessa took the observer seat, a small jump seat between and slightly behind the 2 pilot seats, normally used by check airmen or FAA inspectors. Sarah handed her the laptop from her backpack, a sleek black MacBook that Alessa had bought 6 months ago for her graphic design classes but that still had her old Air Force technical manuals saved in encrypted folders she had never been able to delete. Robert handed her his radio headset. She couldn't speak into it, but she could listen. She pulled the headphones over her ears just as Viper's voice came through. "American 317, what's your plan? Because from where I'm sitting, you've got maybe 90 seconds before you're completely out of ideas." Robert looked at Alessa. She was already typing on her phone, her expression transformed from the blank, distant look she'd worn in seat 14A to something sharp and focused and alive. She held the phone up and Robert read it aloud into the radio. "Viper, we have a drone pilot aboard. Former Air Force. She says she's going to fly this aircraft like a drone. Using asymmetric thrust, minimal control surfaces, and visual guidance from your position." There was a long silence on the radio. Then Viper's voice came back, and it carried something that sounded like shock and something else that sounded like recognition. American 317, call sign of that drone pilot? Everyone in the cockpit froze. How would he know to ask that? How would a random F-16 pilot know anything about a drone operator aboard a civilian aircraft? Robert looked at Alessa. She was staring at the radio like it had spoken her name, her face pale, her hands suddenly shaking. Slowly, her fingers moved across her phone screen and she held it up. Phantom. Robert keyed the radio. She says her call sign is Phantom. Another silence. Then Viper's voice came through, and now it was filled with something close to awe. Holy shit. Is that actually Lieutenant Alessa Novak? Is Phantom aboard your aircraft? Robert looked at Alessa again. Tears were suddenly streaming down her face, but she nodded. Affirmative, Viper. That's her. American 317, you listen to me very carefully. Viper's voice was suddenly commanding, absolutely certain. You need to let her try. I know her record. I flew air support for her missions in Afghanistan. She's a legend. She once landed a Reaper with 70% hydraulic damage using nothing but throttle control and prayer. She guided a Predator home through a sandstorm with zero visibility using only instruments and math. If anyone on this planet can fly an unflyable aircraft, it's Phantom. You let her try, or I guarantee you're not going to make it. Robert stared at Alessa, this young woman who couldn't speak, who wore a scarf to hide her neck like she was hiding her disability, who everyone on this aircraft had dismissed as just a poor disabled passenger. But Viper knew her. Viper believed in her. And right now, Viper's belief was the only chance they had. Do it, Robert said. Fly my aircraft, Lieutenant. Alessa wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand. Her fingers moved across her laptop keyboard, pulling up files she had kept despite knowing she should delete them, aircraft schematics, flight control algorithms, aerodynamic calculation spreadsheets. She opened a text document and began typing, her words appearing on both her laptop screen and on Robert's primary flight display through the aircraft system that she had just hacked into using her old Air Force access credentials that somehow, miraculously, still worked. She typed, Captain, I will send you instructions via text on your display. Execute exactly as I say, when I say. No delays. No second guessing. I cannot speak to explain my decisions. You must trust me. Robert read it and nodded. Understood. Jessica, you're on system monitoring. Call out any changes. I'm on flight controls executing Phantom's instructions. Alessa's fingers flew across her keyboard. She was pulling up aircraft schematics, calculating thrust vectors, analyzing what little hydraulic pressure remained in the failing systems. She couldn't see outside like she had in her old drone cockpit, couldn't see through the multiple cameras mounted on a Reaper, couldn't zoom in and assess terrain from 15 different angles. But Viper could be her eyes. She typed a message that appeared both on her laptop and on Robert's display, Viper, I need your eyes. Describe terrain. Find me anywhere flat enough for emergency landing. Viper's voice came through the headset immediately, copy that, Phantom. You're currently at 16,000 feet over mountainous terrain, descending at 800 feet per minute uncontrolled. I'm scanning, okay, I've got something. There's a dry lake bed 12 miles ahead, bearing 095 degrees. It's your only option. It's short, rough, not suitable for any commercial aircraft, but it's flat and it's what you've got. Alessa closed her eyes for 3 seconds, visualizing. 12 miles at their current speed was approximately 3 minutes. Descending at 800 feet per minute uncontrolled meant they'd lose about 2,400 feet. They'd hit the lake bed at around 13,000 feet elevation, which meant the air density was thinner, which meant they'd need higher approach speed, which meant longer rollout, which meant this was going to be incredibly dangerous. But it was possible. Barely. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, Viper, I need exact bearing, distance updates every 30 seconds, wind direction and speed at lakebed elevation. Copy, Phantom. Bearing 095, 11.7 miles, wind is 270 at 15 knots. The coordination became a ballet between three people operating on the edge of human capability, Viper providing visual guidance from his F-16, Robert physically manning the dying controls of the 777, and Alessa sending instructions through typed messages that appeared on the flight display, her commands precise and confident and brilliant. Increase left engine to 87%, decrease right engine to 71%. That differential will turn US without needing ailerons. Robert executed immediately. The aircraft began a slow turn to the right, rotating on the axis created by unequal thrust. It was jerky and imprecise, but it was working. Raise nose 3 degrees using only elevator trim, not control yoke. Do not fight the yoke. Jessica adjusted the trim wheel. The nose came up slightly, reducing their descent rate from 800 feet per minute to 600. Viper, distance 10.2 miles, Phantom. You're on course. Deploy landing gear now even though we're high. Drag will help US descend controllably. Jessica looked at Robert with alarm. Captain, deploying gear at this speed and altitude risks. Do it, Robert said. His trust was absolute now. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical whine and a heavy thunk that passengers felt through the floor. The aircraft shuddered as drag increased dramatically, but the descent rate stabilized. Alessa had calculated it perfectly, the gear drag was acting like a speed brake, giving them controlled descent without needing hydraulics. Each instruction was precise, confident, brilliant. Jessica watched in growing awe as this mute woman piloted a 350-ton aircraft using only mathematics, intuition, and an understanding of flight dynamics that came from thousands of hours operating drones in combat situations where any mistake meant death. But there was something else Jessica saw, something in the way Alessa's hands occasionally trembled between typing commands, the way tears continued to stream silently down her face even as her instructions remained flawless, the way she sometimes closed her eyes for a second as if fighting back memories. This woman was terrified. This woman was traumatized. But she was flying anyway. In the cabin, the flight attendants had prepared everyone for impact. Passengers were in brace positions, heads down, hands gripping ankles or the seat backs in front of them. Sarah Morrison walked through the aisles one final time, checking that everyone was secured, offering words of comfort that felt hollow against the reality of what was coming. She stopped at row 14 where the businessman and elderly couple sat. That young woman, the elderly woman said, the one who couldn't speak, she's helping fly us. Yes, ma'am, Sarah said. She's Air Force. She's one of the best. The businessman whispered to no one in particular, I thought she was disabled. She is disabled, Sarah said quietly. And she's also the only reason we might survive this. The aircraft descended toward the dry lakebed. Viper provided updates in his calm fighter pilot voice, the voice of someone who had faced death enough times that it became just another variable to calculate. 7 miles, Phantom. You're on glide path. 5 miles. 3 miles. 2 miles. Looking good, looking good. 1 mile, Phantom, be advised, your approach speed is high. You're coming in 40 knots above normal landing speed. Rollout is going to be long. Very long. Alessa's fingers typed, I know. No choice. Thin air plus heavy aircraft plus minimal control equals fast approach required. Understood. Half mile. Quarter mile. Phantom, this is going to be rough, but you've got this. You've done impossible things before. Alessa closed her eyes for 1 second and saw that pink shoe tumbling through smoke. Then she opened them and focused on the present, on the 267 people depending on her, on proving that her trauma didn't define her, that her silence didn't mean inability, that she was still Lieutenant Alessa, Phantom, Novak even without her voice. 200 feet, Jessica called out, reading altitude. 150. 100. The ground rushed up through the cockpit windows. The lake bed was coming fast, too fast, the speed all wrong for landing but the only speed that would keep them from stalling. 50 feet. Captain, on my command, kill all engine power. Maximum brakes even if they barely work. Robert's hand hovered over the throttle controls, ready. The main landing gear touched the lake bed. The impact was catastrophic. It felt like the aircraft had hit a concrete wall. The entire airframe shuddered with a force that made seat bolts scream in protest. Passengers were thrown forward against their restraints despite being in brace position. The businessman in 14B felt his ribs crack. The elderly woman bit her tongue and tasted blood. The aircraft bounced, lifted off the lake bed for 3 seconds of heart-stopping terror where it seemed like they would porpoise and cartwheel and break apart. But Alessa had anticipated the bounce. Her next command was already on Robert's screen, engines full reverse thrust now. Nose gear down hard. The engines roared in reverse. The nose gear slammed down, and the aircraft settled onto all 3 landing gear, now rolling across the rough lake bed surface at over 200 miles per hour. Max brakes. Do not worry about brake failure. Just max pressure. Robert stood on the brake pedals with both feet, every muscle straining. The brakes, with barely any hydraulic pressure, bit weakly but they bit. The aircraft began to slow. But not fast enough. The lake bed streaked past. A mountain loomed ahead, getting closer, closer. They were going to hit it. They were going to run out of ground. Alessa's fingers flew across her keyboard one final time, thrust reversers to maximum. Emergency brake application. Steer right 15 degrees. The aircraft veered right in a sickening slide, bleeding speed, engines screaming in full reverse, brakes smoking, tires shredding. The mountain was so close Robert could see individual trees on its slope. 300 yards from impact. 200 yards. 100 yards. Then, finally, impossibly, miraculously, the aircraft stopped. 53 yards from the base of the mountain. All 267 passengers and crew alive. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence in the cabin. Every passenger sat frozen in brace position, unable to process that they had stopped, that they were alive, that the impact they'd been bracing for wasn't coming. Then someone sobbed. And suddenly everyone was crying, screaming, laughing with the kind of hysterical relief that comes from staring directly at death and watching it blink first. In the cockpit, Robert pulled off his headset with shaking hands. His face was soaked with sweat and tears. He turned to Alessa, who was sitting in the observer seat with her hands still on her laptop, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking with adrenaline crash. "You just saved 267 lives," Robert said, his voice breaking. How do I even thank you?" Alessa's hands moved shakily across her keyboard. The message appeared on her screen. "You already did. You trusted me when I couldn't speak for myself. When everyone else saw disability, you saw ability. That's all I needed." Outside the aircraft, the 2 F-16s performed a victory roll, a celebratory maneuver that fighter pilots execute when something worth celebrating has just happened. Viper's voice came through the radio one last time. "Phantom, that was the most beautiful piece of flying I have ever witnessed. You proved today that legends are made, not born. Welcome back." The emergency evacuation was orderly despite the rough terrain. Flight attendants deployed the evacuation slides and passengers streamed out onto the cracked surface of the dry lake bed, many of them kissing the ground, many of them hugging strangers, all of them alive against all odds. When Alessa finally emerged from the aircraft, one of the last to evacuate, she was immediately surrounded by passengers who had watched her board in Chicago with pity and who now looked at her with something close to worship. The elderly woman from seat 14C pushed through the crowd and grabbed Alessa's face in both hands, kissing her forehead. "Angel," she said in Spanish. Ángel silencioso que Dios nos envió. The businessman from 14B pushed forward, and Alessa saw that he was crying. He took her hand in both of his and shook it, unable to speak, unable to find words adequate to thank someone who had just given him his life back. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, holding her mother's hand, pressed a small stuffed elephant into Alessa's arms. "You can have Mr. Trunk," she said seriously. "Because you saved us, and heroes should have something to keep them safe too." Alessa held the stuffed elephant and nodded, unable to type on her phone because her hands were shaking too badly. The rescue helicopters arrived 40 minutes later, National Guard, Air Force, civilian emergency services, all converging on the lakebed. News crews followed within hours. By that evening, the story was breaking across every major network. The silent hero of Flight 317. Mute Air Force veteran lands crippled airliner, saves 267. When words failed, skills spoke, the incredible story of Lieutenant Alessa Novak. But when reporters shoved microphones in Alessa's face and cameras filmed her standing on that lake bed with dust in her hair and tears drying on her cheeks, she simply pulled out her phone and typed a message that would be quoted in newspapers and magazines and television broadcasts around the world. "I just did what I was trained to do. Voice or no voice, I'm still a pilot. Silence doesn't mean inability. Trauma doesn't mean useless. I'm still here. I can still contribute." And sometimes the most important things we have to say don't require words, they require courage, skill, and the refusal to let our disabilities define our worth. 3 months later, Alessa received an official letter on Department of Defense letterhead requesting her presence at a meeting at the Pentagon. She took the train from Phoenix to Washington, D.C., watching the country pass outside her window and thinking about how much her life had changed since that afternoon over Colorado. The meeting was in a secure briefing room with generals, engineers, and Air Force brass filling leather chairs around a polished table. Alessa sat at one end with her laptop, her method of communication, her voice without sound. General Patricia Morrison, no relation to Flight Attendant Sarah Morrison, but a 3-star general who commanded Air Force Special Operations, stood at the head of the table and addressed the room. "Lieutenant Novak, what you accomplished on Flight 317 has fundamentally changed our understanding of several critical areas. First, it proved that advanced drone operators possess skills that are directly transferable to real-world aviation crisis situations. Second, it demonstrated that remote piloting techniques can be adapted to manned aircraft emergency scenarios. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it showed us that disability is not inability, that we've been underutilizing trained personnel simply because they don't fit traditional operational profiles." The general pressed a button and a presentation appeared on the large screen, Remote Emergency Aviation Support Program. "We're creating a new program, Lieutenant. Drone pilots on standby who can assist civilian aircraft in distress using satellite uplinks, real-time data feeds, and communication protocols similar to what you improvised on Flight 317. We want you to lead it." Alessa stared at the screen. Her fingers moved slowly across her laptop keyboard, and her words appeared on the display screen at the front of the room. "I can't speak. How can I lead anything? How can I command personnel, give briefings, coordinate operations when I have no voice?" General Morrison smiled. "Lieutenant, you just flew an impossible approach using nothing but typed messages and guts. You commanded a cockpit crew, coordinated with fighter escorts, and guided 267 people to safety without speaking a single word. You don't need a voice to be a leader. You need vision, expertise, and the ability to make others believe in possibilities they can't yet see. And Lieutenant, you've got more vision in your silence than most people develop in a lifetime of talking." Another officer stood, Colonel Marcus Chin, who ran the drone operations program at Creech Air Force Base. "Lieutenant Novak, I know what happened 17 months ago. I know about the mission that broke you. I know about the intelligence failure and the children and why you can't speak. But here's what I also know, you made a split-second decision under impossible pressure using the information you had. The failure wasn't yours. It was systemic. And instead of letting that trauma destroy you completely, you channeled it into saving 267 lives over Colorado. That's not the behavior of someone broken. That's the behavior of someone who understands that mistakes don't define us, how we respond to them does. Alessa's hands shook as she typed, but what if I fail again? What if people die because I make the wrong call and I can't even speak to apologize? General Morrison walked around the table and stood beside Alessa's chair. She put her hand on Alessa's shoulder with a gentleness that contradicted her three-star authority. Lieutenant, you will make wrong calls. Every leader does. But you proved something over Colorado that most people never learn, that the absence of perfection doesn't mean the absence of value. You're not looking for redemption, you already earned it. What you're looking for is purpose. Let me give it to you. Help us build something that saves lives. Help us prove that trauma survivors can still contribute. Help us show the world that different abilities create different possibilities. Alessa looked at the presentation on the screen, then at the faces around the table, officers and engineers who were looking at her not with pity but with respect, with expectation, with belief. She typed slowly, when do I start? The Remote Emergency Aviation Support Program launched 6 months later. Alessa led a team of 12 drone operators, all with various disabilities, all with combat experience, all trained to assist civilian aircraft in crisis using satellite communications and real-time data analysis. They saved their first aircraft 3 weeks after going operational, a cargo plane over the Atlantic with landing gear failure that Alessa's team guided to a safe emergency landing using the same techniques she'd improvised over Colorado. They saved their 7th aircraft on the 1-year anniversary of Flight 317, a regional jet in Alaska with control problems that Alessa personally guided through a mountain pass landing while typing commands to a pilot she'd never met and would never speak to with her voice. By the 2nd year, the program had expanded internationally. By the 3rd year, it had saved 42 aircraft and over 3,000 lives. Alessa never regained her voice. The doctors eventually stopped saying, "It might come back," and started saying, "You've learned to live beautifully without it." And they were right. She sat in her control room at Creech Air Force Base, the same base where she'd flown her first combat mission, where she'd made the mistake that had taken her voice, but now the room looked different. Now it was filled with possibility instead of trauma, with purpose instead of guilt. On her desk sat a photo in a silver frame, her standing beside Captain Robert Hayes, First Officer Jessica Park, and the entire crew of Flight 317, all alive, all smiling, all grateful. Beside it sat a small stuffed elephant named Mr. Trunk that a 7-year-old girl had given her on a lake bed in Colorado. Her brother Marcus visited one afternoon, bringing his daughter, Alessa's niece, now 3 years old, to see where Aunt Alessa worked. The little girl watched in fascination as Alessa's fingers flew across keyboards, coordinating responses, monitoring flights, ready to jump in whenever someone needed help. Marcus signed to his sister, "Do you miss your voice?" Alessa stopped typing and looked at him for a long moment. Then her hands moved in the American Sign Language she'd spent 3 years mastering. "I miss what it represented. I miss the simplicity of speaking without thinking. I miss songs and laughter and the sound of my own thoughts coming out loud. But I learned something that day over Colorado, something I couldn't have learned any other way." "What's that?" Marcus signed back. "My voice was never in my throat," Alessa signed, her hands moving with the grace of someone who had turned silence into poetry. "It was in my hands, in my skills, in my training, in my refusal to give up when everyone, including me, thought I was useless. Silence can't take that away. Trauma can't destroy that. Disability can't erase that. My voice was always in my actions, not my words. I just had to learn how to hear it." An alert flashed on her screen, a commercial flight out of Denver reporting control difficulties. Alessa's fingers immediately flew across her keyboard, pulling up flight data, establishing communication protocols, preparing to guide them if needed. Marcus watched his sister transform from quiet civilian to focused operator in seconds. "You found your calling," he signed. Alessa glanced at him and smiled, really smiled, the kind of smile that came from someone who had walked through fire and discovered that they were made of something stronger than they'd believed. She signed back, "I found my voice. It just sounds different than everyone expected." But it turns out the loudest voice in any emergency doesn't need sound, it just needs certainty, skill, and the courage to act when everyone else freezes. The flight from Denver resolved its issue without Alessa's intervention, but she stayed on standby anyway, monitoring, ready, vigilant. Because this was who Lieutenant Alessa Phantom Novak was now, not the broken drone pilot who had lost her voice in a bunker in Nevada, not the disabled passenger people pitted on Flight 317, but something new and powerful and necessary. She was the silent guardian who proved every single day that disability doesn't mean inability, that trauma doesn't have to define you, that the most powerful communication happens not in words but in action. She was Phantom. And Phantom never left, she just learned to fly without words, to lead without speaking, to save lives through the language of skill and mathematics and unshakable determination. Her hands moved across the keyboard, ready for the next emergency, ready to prove once again that sometimes the most important things we have to say require no voice at all, just courage, competence, and the absolute refusal to let silence equal helplessness. The monitor showed dozens of aircraft crossing the country, each one a responsibility, each one a possibility, each one a chance to prove that her voice, her real voice, was louder than ever, even in complete and perfect silence.